Hello, everybody. It's time for your regular Wednesday rum ration, and today we're going to be talking about the Battle of Narvik. But not just one, not just two, but three battles of Narvik. And since he's worked very extensively on both the Norwegian campaign and the tribal class destroyers in particular, who form quite the centerpiece for at least one of these battles, I thought we better get Dr. Alexander Clark involved, because if I didn't, he probably would never forgive me.
It wouldn't have been that bad. I'd have just got revenge in some very distinct way.
Which possibly frightens me even more. Anyway, let's get into the history. So Narvik is a very old town. It goes way back past the Viking era, all the way back to the Bronze Age apparently, but it had turned into a relatively small but important port on the Norwegian coast in the 1870s thanks to being an ice-free exit for Swedish iron ore mining. It had nonetheless had a relatively peaceful existence since then, even during the First World War, but all of that was going to change in 1940 when a series of three important naval battles would take place in and around it in the course of a single month, that being April. In fact, pretty much within the course of a single week, all as a result of the German invasion of Norway. You see, on the 9th of April, there was a powerful flotilla approaching. There were 10 German destroyers comprising most of the remaining large commissioned and modern destroyers of the Kriegsmarine, as there had already been war losses. These were the Georg Thiel, Wolfgang Zenker, Bernd von Arnim, Erich Gies, Erich Kollner, Dieter von Roda, Hans Ludemann, Hermann Kühner, Wilhelm Heidkamp, and Anton Schmidt. Those of you who speak German, please rate out of 10 in the comments below. And they were all under the overall command of Commodore Friedrich Bonter aboard the Wilhelm Heidkamp. And we will mostly be referring to each of these destroyers by their surnames going forward, although I will occasionally give them their full names where appropriate. Now, their primary mission was to deliver the troops that they were carrying, about 200 apiece, to the port, rather than get involved in any protracted surface fighting, at least on the way in. Earlier that month, however, the coastal defence ships Norge and Eidsvold had arrived along with two small submarines, B1 and B3, the submarine tender Lingen, and two auxiliary vessels, Michael Sars and Kelt, all under the command of Commando Capitaine Per Askim. There was one other patrol ship already there. All of these had, however, been spotted by one Herr Wusso, the German vice-consul present in Narvik, who had been dutifully reporting everything back to Berlin. And unfortunately for Askim, his direct superior had chosen that week to go on holiday. And so Askim was left in charge all of a sudden of defence of the entire area, not just Narvik harbour itself, which meant that the Norwegian ships didn't get as much of a chance to establish precise defensive plans or survey the current situation of the harbour and the area around it as they would have liked. And so in the early morning hours of the 9th, the German destroyers began their final approach to Narvik, running into the two auxiliaries previously mentioned and the third patrol craft, the Senja, on the way in. The Norwegians had gone to full alert the previous day due to reports of British mine-laying efforts nearby and were still on short notice readiness. But ahead of the destroyers the previous afternoon, the German tanker Jan Vellum had entered the harbour as a civilian ship. It carried no weapons or troops, but was fully loaded with oil and provisions, ostensibly bound for Germany, but in reality pre-positioning itself as a supply ship for the incoming German warships. Michael Sars and Kelt were on patrol and spotted 9 German destroyers coming in. The Erich Giese had run into engine trouble and was running a bit late. Kelt managed to get out a warning as the two patrol ships took cover, as between them they had less firepower than the anti-aircraft battery on a single German destroyer, which, combined with the various signals they'd been receiving starting just after midnight that spoke of numerous naval incursions heading towards Norwegian ports and instructions to meet any attack with force, rather indicated that something bad was about to go down. Lastly, at 0420, in the middle of the confrontation, came a signal from the Norwegian Admiralty: do not fire at British vessels, fire on German, as by this point it had become clear just who was invading. With the patrol ships bypassed, the next line of defence was the Eidsvold, as Norge was further into the harbour, so that Askim could keep an open line to the Norwegian Admiralty via direct land link and receive further updates. 6 of the destroyers broke off their run up the fjord to secure forts and military bases, which left 3, Heidkamp, Thiele, and Arnim, to confront the first Norwegian surface unit. Aboard Eidsvold and Norge, the situation was somewhat confused. The Senja, the other patrol ship, had sailed out into a snow squall, passing the incoming German trio without actually seeing them, and then, in a case of mistaken identity, reported one of the German destroyers that was landing troops further up the fjord as a British cruiser. This had come as something of a relief to the Norwegians, as with German ships incoming with hostile intent, a British cruiser showing up would be a powerful asset for them to cooperate with against the Kriegsmarine. But a follow-up signal that corrected the observation to a pair of German destroyers appears not to have made it through to the Norwegian flagship. By 0430, Norge had cast off its phone lines and taken up its own defensive position. Whilst being 40 years old at this point, it did have 6 inches of belt armour, half a dozen 6-inch guns, and a pair of 210mm or just over 8-inch guns, as did its sister ship, as well as many smaller anti-surface and anti-aircraft weapons. The coastal defence vessels therefore, in theory, should have been able to give the trio of large destroyers a fairly decent fight, especially in the confined waters where the greater speed of the German ships, which at this point were running almost on fumes anyway, would be significantly less of an issue. Unfortunately for the Norwegians, gale force winds and sheets of thick snow and sleet were cutting visibility massively, and with it, any range advantage the two ships might otherwise have possessed. And with the reduced visibility went their ability to mutually support each other as well. This had already become apparent as, with less information to hand than Norge, Eidsvold had already run into the Germans, the destroyers appearing out of a wall of snow at only a few hundred meters range. Instead of opening fire immediately, Eidsvold trained its guns on the intruders and ordered them to stop, with a warning shot then landing in Heidecamp's wake when the signal lamp message failed to get any response. The German ships duly slowed down and sent over a couple of men in a boat, who, when escorted to Eidsvold's bridge, declared something along the lines of, "Congratulations, you are being defended from the British. Please do not resist." These new friends also demanded that the ship surrender, shut down its engines, and disable all of its guns. Eidsvold's captain said that he'd have to check in with Askim aboard Norge, but the German officer refused to wait and headed back to his ship instead, which had kept its guns set fore and aft, but had also quietly trained its torpedoes on the Norwegian vessel. Captain Villuk of the Eidsvold radioed Askim, and he quickly received a terse order to open fire. But tragically, instead of simply following this order, Villuk first went to tell the German officer, whose boat was just in the process of casting off, that he was going to fight, which in turn allowed Korvettenkapitan Gerlach, the officer in question, to fire off a red flare from his little boat, which was the prearranged signal indicating that the Norwegians had decided to fight, and thus the German destroyers knew what was about to happen before most of the Eidsvold's own crew did. Once he returned to the bridge, Villuk ordered the ship to full power and turned towards the nearest destroyer. The Germans themselves were under orders not to fire first, as they hoped that the occupation could be done peacefully, but since Eidsvold's actions appeared to be hostile, pretty soon 4 torpedoes were in the water from the Heidkamp. Quite why Eidsvold didn't open fire in the 2 minutes between acceleration and the torpedoes hitting it will forever remain unclear. The range was point blank, and her extensive gun batteries already had the Germans entirely dead to rights. They could have gotten off 2 to 3 salvos from the main guns and half a dozen from the lesser guns. But in the event, the order to fire, according to survivors, appeared to finally have been given at around about the same time that 2 or possibly 3 of the torpedoes from the German destroyer smashed into its side. Now, Eidsvold might have been carrying enough armour to hang in a gunfight with the German destroyers for a while, but her turn-of-the-century vintage meant that her torpedo protection was basically non-existent, and the forward magazines promptly detonated, followed shortly thereafter by either the boilers or the aft magazines, and within moments all that was left of the ship was drifting smoke and a bit of the stern slipping beneath the waves, taking 177 men with her, leaving only 8 survivors.
And the thing is, the question about why she didn't fire is actually something which comes up as quite often a bit of a debate. But there was there were 2 quite strong movements within the Norwegian military that would mitigate. And I think my view is the Navy is more infected than one than the other. There is often a view that's put forward, there are lots of Nazi sympathizers. Well, That wasn't really as strong within the Norwegian military as it might have been. There are some in the army, but they're very few and far between, and very noisy afterwards because of what happens. But they're not so much a major force in the thing. But there is quite a strong history of neutrality, and their thinking is that they can force them to back by acting aggressively. They will force them back. That the Germans don't want to fight them. That they don't want this extra fight. That they'll manage to push them away. That by looking scary and big and mean, that it will work. The trouble is the Germans have sort of learnt the lesson from what the British had done in the Altmark incident, where the British had just gone past the Norwegians and to an extent ignored them straight into the fjord and gone, yeah, we're sorry, but we're going to do this anyway. And the Norwegians hadn't done anything. In this scenario, he's got all these guns. He could have done some serious wrecking on the German destroyers. Let's be honest, if they'd been hit by an 8-inch shell at that range, there wouldn't be much left of any of those destroyers, even with an 8-inch shell that age. The 6-inch shells would have done enough damage. So odds are, yes, they'd have sunk her, but there would have been 3 destroyers on the bottom. And that's an interesting question for what happens afterwards, because if the 3 destroyers had been sunk there, do they continue on with the operation? They've just lost 3 destroyers. They've just lost 30% of their force. What does that mean for the rest of the operation? And it's entirely because, he doesn't want to start a war.
Yeah, and it would have been the flagship, so it would have been the commanding officer of both of troops and of the destroyer flotilla itself, which, as we'll see, the people who picked up the slack for the Commodore Bonte later on were possibly not the best qualified. So that's the end of Eidsvold. But at the mouth of the harbour of Narvik itself, Norge had actually earlier spotted a couple of German destroyers at long range, but that was in a gap between snow squalls, and the snow had closed in again before they could actually do anything. In the interim, after that, they heard the conversation with Eidsvold, then the sound of a massive double explosion that marked the end of the ship, and that meant that Norge was ready to fight the moment anything showed up, but visibility was utterly abysmal. Less than a mile had separated Eidsvold from Norge, and yet absolutely nothing had been seen of her sister ship's end, not even the flicker of light from the flames of the explosion, just the rolling sound of the explosions themselves. The snow now lifted slightly, and it turned out that 2 of the German destroyers were already docked up and landing troops, having completely missed and bypassed the Norge in the driving snow as they passed through the harbour entrance. Norge did immediately open fire, but despite the almost point-blank range, most of the shells went somewhat long, as even at less than half a mile, the German ships could barely be seen. The German ships themselves fired back with an almost equal lack of accuracy, but the range was short enough that there were skirls of machine gun rounds spattering off Norge's superstructure, probably just driven more by the wind than by any particular aim at the bridge. Bernd von Arnim also began to fire off partial salvos of torpedoes, but despite Norge being stationary, all but the last pair missed. Unfortunately, the last 2 did hit, one amidships and one aft, and in a virtual repeat of Eidsvold, the ship's magazines detonated again, taking 105 men to the bottom. This time 96 would be rescued, in part thanks to the numerous boats that were almost immediately launched from the nearby merchant ships, and to their credit, by the crew of the Arnim itself. As the sun rose, at least as far as anyone could make out, the Geyser finally arrived, and the 3 patrol ships were informed of the destruction of the 2 larger vessels and subsequently ordered back into harbour under German guns. With the little other option available to them, they had to comply. The German destroyers, with their troops ashore, now moved to refuel from the Jan Velum. There was just enough fuel to refill the bunkers of all 10 destroyers aboard, but that was all. Any further operations would draw down on the destroyers' fuel reserves, which in turn meant that without another tanker, they were never going to make it back to Germany unless they left almost immediately, or they stopped off elsewhere down the coast. Now, the Germans had thought of this, and 2 other tankers had been sent behind the invasion force, but the Kattegat, which was headed for Narvik itself, would be stopped and subsequently sunk by the Norwegian vessel Nordkapp later on the 9th, whilst the Skagerrak, which was heading for Trondheim, but in theory carried enough fuel to help out the Narvik force as well, would end up being intercepted by HMS Suffolk a few days later whilst it was still at sea. The other issue was that with only one ship, a maximum of 2 destroyers could be refueled at once, and with fairly weak pumps, this took time. So instead of heading home the same evening, as was planned, the Kriegsmarine force found itself still refueling the next day, the 10th, with some of the ships still not having had a chance to address their effectively empty fuel tanks. Heidkamp, Arnhem and Thiel had full tanks, but everybody else was either partly filled or still waiting. 3 U-boats had shown up in the vicinity to help with defence, but with the longer than planned stay, 6 more were ordered to proceed to Narvik at top speed. Exhausted, and with the weather remaining abysmal, Commodore Bonte ordered a destroyer to run picket duty to support the U-boats overnight. That was the end of the first Battle of Narvik, but it wasn't the end of the entire situation, as the British had spent the past couple of days trying to find and engage the Germans, mostly without success, but they now had an opportunity, since they could for once say with certainty exactly where a large Kriegsmarine force was to be found, although they didn't know exactly how many ships were present. And thus the Admiralty ordered Captain Bernard Warburton-Lee to take forces into Narvik and destroy any German warships he found there, with an aim to capture it from the Germans now that Germany and Norway were officially at war and Royal Navy ships would be welcomed by the Norwegians. Whilst he had 8 destroyers immediately available, 4 of them, the Esk, Ivanhoe, Icarus and Greyhound, constituted a mine-laying force and had no torpedoes or aft guns, apart from Greyhound, which was operating in support of the other 3. And so he would take Hardy, Hotspur, Hunter and Havoc off towards Narvik. The light cruiser Penelope was too far away to join up in time, but HMS Hostile showed up randomly and decided to help, having first found the battlecruiser HMS Repulse and her escort before Repulse had kindly pointed her in the direction of Warburton-Lee.
And one of the interesting things with this scenario is Warburton-Lee is getting the orders, and there are 2 other captains going around of destroyer flotillas, because there's both the 4th and 6th destroyer flotillas, originally the 1st and 2nd tribal flotillas, in the area on operations going, you've sent the H-class ships to do the reconnaissance. And afterwards they're sort of going through, and it turns out that the Admiralty had been basically were so worried about air attack that they felt the tribals should be concentrated with the principal assets to protect them because they were the best at air defense. So instead of using those particular destroyers for the reconnaissance, which is what they've been built for, because part of their duties have been part of the A to K line, which was supposed to be the reconnaissance position of the Royal Navy, they were using the H class, who could do it. But let's be honest, if you had your choice between going into a fjord where you would likely getting into close quarters combat with enemy destroyers, Drac, which would you prefer to be in? An H-class or HMS Eskimo?
Well, Eskimo has double the guns.
Yeah, that does help.
So we have Warburton-Lee and his 5 destroyers, and they started to move up towards Vesterfjorden, as the big fjord that Narvik sits at the top of is called. And they found some local pilots near the entrance. And at this point, they were informed of something approaching the size of the true German force, although the pilots had only seen 6 vessels, and so they said there were 6 destroyers instead of what Warburton-Lee had initially thought, which was 1 or 2. They also mentioned that the German destroyers were individually far larger than the just under 1,500-ton standard displacement H-class. But nonetheless, after some deliberation, given a direct order to attack, Warburton-Lee decided he was going to proceed, informing the Admiralty as the ships headed up the fjord of the new revised likely opposition. Vice Admiral Whitworth was aboard HMS Renown, and he wasn't the happiest with the situation. He actually wanted Warburton-Lee to wait for a few hours, whilst he ordered Penelope, along with 3 of the tribal class and 1 K-class destroyer, to go in and assist, this being Punjabi, Bedouin, Eskimo and Kimberley, with Renown and its own escorts bearing in from the west if time could be spared. But in the end, he decided against ordering Warburton-Lee to wait, which was a decision he would later come to regret and express that regret in writing. The 5 destroyers, as they headed in, were spotted by U-51, but as they were heading southwest at the time as part of anti-submarine zigzagging, this gave Bonta the impression that the 5 destroyers were just a patrol group heading off in some other random direction. In fact, soon after U-51 broke contact, the ships doubled back into snowstorms, and with their lines offset slightly to starboard, allowing all the ship's forward guns to open fire in case something popped up ahead of them at close range, they proceeded towards their destination. They were, however, forced to use a combination of Dead Reckoning and ASDIC, which we now know as sonar, in order to work their way slowly up the fjord, because they couldn't see anything, and indeed the only sign they had that they were in the fjord was the fact they hadn't run out of sea. In the murk, a random ferry loomed up out of the snow, which forced Hostile to break off its position in order to avoid a collision, thus losing contact and forcing Hostile to make its own way up the channel. In the midst of all of this, another signal came in suggesting that Eidsvold and Norge might be in German hands, but this didn't seem to shake Warburton-Lee from his course, and by 2:30 in the morning of the 10th, less than 24 hours after the German assault, the British ships had cleared the narrowest part of the fjord and were accelerating to attack speed. Visibility was still utterly abysmal, though. U-25 and U-46 had been stationed on opposite sides of the narrows, which were barely 3 kilometers across at best, and they didn't see a thing, as the flotilla passed almost too close for even their torpedoes to arm. The Dieter von Roeder had relieved the Anton Schmidt on patrol duty overnight, but around 4:20 in the morning the sun rose, and believing that his orders were to patrol until sunrise, Korvettenkapitan Holtorf took his ship back into the harbour. Meanwhile, HMS Hostile had managed to catch up with the rest of the British ships, and 10 minutes after the Roeder headed back through the harbour entrance, Warburton-Lee's vessels were doing exactly the same thing. At less than half a mile's visibility, the British officers scanned the vague outlines of the numerous freighters in an effort to spot if there were any Kriegsmarine vessels present. One destroyer was spotted sitting between 2 freighters, and HMS Hardy, the flagship, promptly fired 3 torpedoes and accelerated away. 2 more destroyers came into sight, and the rear torpedo launcher sent 4 more torpedoes downrange before the Royal Navy ships opened fire with their main guns. Aboard the German ships, alarms sounded as the sounds of gunfire echoed across the harbour, but for the flagship it was already too late. 1 torpedo hit one of the nearby freighters, but the next one hit the hide camp on the stern, and for a 3rd time in less than 24 hours a ship's magazine detonated, the 3 aft turrets flying through the air in a kind of pyrotechnic fleur-de-lis, and the rear half of the ship pretty much ceased to be, along with 80 of the crew, including Commodore Bronte. What was left of the hide camp was, to the crew's credit, very quickly tied to the other nearby freighter in order to avoid sinking into the rather icy waters of the fjord. The next ship in line was HMS Hunter, who fired all of its torpedoes at an anchored destroyer and several nearby merchantmen. Several of the merchantmen took hits, and the destroyer, the Anton Schmidt, was hit amidships by both shells and torpedoes, with the ship beginning to list heavily and settle by the stern. With Hardy laying a smokescreen and all the gun smoke from the guns firing, visibility had gotten even worse, if indeed that was actually possible, and so HMS Havoc had to settle for a brief exchange of fire with the Hermann Körner before coming across the Schmidt and putting another torpedo into it for good measure, breaking the ship in 2 and sending it to the bottom as well. The Dieter von Roeder was just in the process of letting down anchors, having come back off of its patrol, when all hell broke loose behind them. With only flashes in the murk to aim at, a brief burst of gunfire was sent downrange, but this was curtailed as the snow moved in again and even the gun flashes vanished. Acting on a flash of inspiration, Captain Holtdorf ordered instead that the ship's 8 torpedo tubes were to be fired back the way they'd come. And with absolutely no warning, the torpedoes shortly thereafter appeared heading straight for the British destroyers. But luckily for them, they were riding relatively high in the water since they'd used up most of their own fuel, and the waters of the harbour were somewhat fresher than the ocean's salty depths, which in turn meant that the torpedoes tended to run a fraction deeper, and so what could have been a battle-engine barrage simply passed harmlessly beneath Warburton-Lee's ships. Hermann Kuehne ripped itself free of the tanker and headed into the fight, only to find itself almost in touching distance of the Anton Schmidt when it was blown in two. The shockwaves from the explosion crippled Kuehne's engines, leaving it to drift into the wreck of the Schmidt. And as the British pulled out of the harbour for the first time, a brief patch of calm allowed the Roeder and Hans Ludemann to fire at the Havoc. But Havoc's gunnery proved to be the superior, crippling Hans Ludemann with two nasty hits and sending the ship careening out of the fight out of control. Stray torpedoes from both sides were now slamming into the harbour walls and the sheer sides of the fjord, amplified by the huge cliffs to sound like the end of days, and provoking some of the anti-aircraft guns to open fire wildly into the sky as they thought that the rolling explosions meant that a bombing assault was underway, which just added to the din. Hotspur and Hostile had gone looking for shore batteries, which had been reported, but finding none, headed towards the explosions in time to find the other three destroyers pulling out of the harbour. They fired torpedoes into the harbour, laid smoke, and then Hostile decided to pop in anyway to take a quick pop at the Roeder, crippling the German vessel with 5 hits that set the ship on fire and wrecked its rudder control, 2 boiler rooms, and destroyed one of the main gun turrets.
It was, in all, a very friendly visit from the British destroyer force. It's exactly what you would expect them to do. They turn up, they give people a nice load of scones and jam, or is that torpedoes and shells? I'm never quite sure. But to this point, they're actually doing really, really well. And this is the point that's often forgotten when we talk about the Battles of Narvik. We talk a lot about the second British Battle of Narvik, the third overall, because there is this lovely thing called Warspite there, and there are these tribal destroyers and all these things. But even in this scenario, the destroyers which aren't supposed to really be doing this job, or if they are doing this job, are supposed to be doing it in conjunction with a nice tribal destroyer sitting there to go, if you want to get in a gunfight with my friends, I will beat you up first. They are doing very, very well. And this is because, as I often try and make the point about the Royal Navy Destroyer Force, it's kind of sort of a bit unique amongst the navies in that the Destroyer Force does consider itself an elite. The tribals consider themselves an elite within an elite. So I'm not sure how you can explain that in modern world terms. Probably the difference between, I don't know, the Green Berets and Delta Force or something like that. But the destroyer force consider themselves elite, so they do all sorts of extra gunnery practice. They do all sorts of work extra above and beyond. So when you're sitting there going, they're doing better in the gunnery duel, despite the fact that they have the slightly smaller guns, they have slightly less guns. So really, you would expect them to be coming off. Well, they're probably using them far more accurately. They're probably firing a lot faster, and those crews are probably trained within the nth of their life to make sure they're getting this right.
Yeah. They said that the Germans certainly weren't expecting it, but even when it was a 2v1 with the German ships actually having more guns per ship, at this point the H-class was coming off the better. And so as light grew, or shall we say in the weather conditions, the snow got slightly whiter around about 5:30 in the morning, Warburton-Lee took stock. He concluded that they'd engaged 4 or possibly 5 German ships, which to his reckoning left 1 or 2 lying around somewhere else, since the reports they'd heard earlier had suggested 6 ships, not 10, were present. And he still had 18 torpedoes across his flotilla, although he had already fired off 24. In fact, of course, there were 5 German destroyers outside the harbour scattered along the fjord, and the Ludemann had managed to get off a signal which alerted them to the attack. Oblivious to this, the British ships made another sweep through the harbour, but found little that they hadn't already shot up. Ludemann got off another 4 torpedoes, but these too ran deep. Warburton-Lee was deciding if he should send landing parties in to engage the German troops ashore when 3 more destroyers were spotted coming down the fjord at them. These were Wolfgang Zenker, Erich Gies, and Erich Köllner. With visibility finally improving, HMS Hardy opened fire with all guns at just over 7,000 yards and received a withering barrage in return. The German ships, led by one Fregattenkapitän Bay, more on him in future episodes of World War II, were on full alert, and although they were desperately short on fuel, One of them had actually shut down a number of its boilers due to simply having no oil in nearby tanks to feed them, but they did have the tactical advantage. A running gunfight now developed, with the Germans getting the better of it as visibility dropped and came back again repeatedly as snow squalls started to move across the fjord. Elsewhere, Fregattenkapitan Friedrich Berger had Georg Thiele and Bernard von Arnim also closing in and managed to cut in unseen ahead of the British destroyers, crossing the T of the British ships and opening up with all 10 guns available to him. Not realizing that in a heavy squall that was following them, the three chasing German ships had actually chosen to drop back, Warburton-Lee didn't realize he actually had a local 5 versus 2 advantage, and he could have focused his flotilla much more closely on the 2 German ships ahead. Georg Thiele started to score hits on Hardy, knocking out her forward guns, and then the bridge, and then the superstructure, fatally wounding Warburton-Lee. Arnim joined in, and the boilers were quickly destroyed as well. With Hardy coasting to a stop, Lieutenant Stanning, the last man left standing on the bridge, ordered the ship hard to port and ran it aground on the south side of the fjord to allow the men to abandon ship without having to spend much, if any, time in the freezing water, with the aftmost gun still engaged in covering fire until it ran out of ammunition. Next to feel the tender mercies of Thiele and Arnim was Havoc, as the other 3 British ships were largely hidden from view in their own smokescreen, as well as the gun and funnel smoke of the 2 leading destroyers. Despite the range now closing to about 3,000 yards, Havoc seemed to be almost immune to incoming fire. One of the few shells that actually hit her did land next to an ammunition locker, but then failed to detonate, and a nearby crewman summarily threw it overboard. Torpedoes from both sides hissed out, but accomplished pretty much nothing, as the rapid changes of bearing that were involved in this shipborne version of a knife fight made accurate estimates of lead almost impossible for the torpedo officers. At this point, somewhat concerned as to what had happened to Hardy, and with the 2 German destroyers ahead pulling away slightly, Havoc doubled back, leaving Hunter as the lead ship. Now, luck began to run out for both sides, and Thiele and Hunter rapidly tore into each other, taking each other apart in a blizzard of shell hits, to which the fire of everything down to the light anti-aircraft weapons on both sides was added. A torpedo from Thiele finally managed to score a German hit with this weapons type, and Hunter began to slow rapidly, causing Hotspur behind it, which was having issues of its own from shell hits to the rudder, coming from Arnim, ending up ramming the Hunter from behind. With the 2 entangled ships now engaged fully by Bay's destroyers and the other 3 active German ships making a reappearance, with Hostile and Havoc having pulled ahead, and Hunter promptly rolling over and sinking when Hotspur finally managed to reverse, largely by means of her captain heading aft under fire and then yelling orders down to the engine and steering rooms through the hatches near X turret, Hotspur was left at the mercy of all 5 German ships. But then, up ahead came renewed gunfire as Hostile and Havoc wheeled about and charged back in to rescue the beleaguered destroyer. With Hostile laying a smokescreen, the 3 destroyers made off again, battering Thiele still further on their way out. With visibility still not that great and many of the active destroyers now critically low on fuel, after a short chase by Kolner, the 3 remaining British ships were left to their own devices. The Germans instead busied themselves picking up survivors from Hunter, and later went looking for Hardy, whose wreck had floated away across the fjord at high tide and then keeled over in a completely different location. Heading back out, the 3 British ships scared U-46 into crash diving by popping out of a bank of driving snow at almost point-blank range, before running into the supply ship Rauenfels, which was heading in with heavy weapons for the troops ashore and more ammunition for the destroyers. The British ships opened fire, the German ship ran ashore, and having realised that she'd caught fire at some point, the British ship sent a couple more shells downrange just to make sure the ship couldn't be salvaged, one of them apparently hitting the stored German ammunition, and that rather ensured that salvaging the ship or anything aboard it wouldn't be a problem for anyone anytime soon. One last set of torpedoes would be fired that day. U-25 and U-51 at the entrance to Vestfjorden tried to take out the exiting British ships, but due to a mixture of the same problems as the German destroyers' torpedoes, as well as issues with the magnetic detonators equipped on the U-boat torpedoes this far north, all of the torpedoes either ran deep or detonated early. On balance, the British had come off of this battle somewhat the better. They'd lost 2 destroyers with another heavily damaged, but in exchange there were 2 German vessels sunk, the Schmidt and Heidkamp, with Roeder and Arnhem reduced to stationary defence batteries through damage, along with heavy damage to Thiel. Ludemann and Kühne had moderate damage, and Kölner was still suffering from engine trouble. They'd also expended a lot of their ammunition and many of their torpedoes, as well as a number of merchant ships from various countries which were now resting on the seabed and thus unavailable to reinforce the Kriegsmarine and Germany's small merchant and support fleet. This left only Wolfgang Zenker and Erich Giese fully operational at the end of the day, albeit with 3 more ships likely to be combat capable again before long. Whilst Penelope and the Tribals arriving in a pincer manoeuvre might have saved Hunter and Hardy as well as ended the German threat there and then, unfortunately this wasn't to be. Instead, Penelope, the Tribals, Kimberley and Greyhound met up with the remaining H's on the way out. Hotspur was sent for repairs with Hostile escorting it, whilst Eskimo and Bedouin patrolled at the entrance to the fjord, witnessing a couple of large explosions ahead of them which caused them to turn away, believing that they'd encountered a remote detonated minefield. In fact, it was the luckless U-25 again, launching yet another pair of torpedoes, which once again prematurely detonated. And Penelope and the destroyers thus formed a loose blockade and awaited further orders.
One wonders if U-25's commander developed a small complex about this particular issue in the war due to premature issues. But leaving that to one side, that is again classic what the British have been planning to do with them. You've got the Tribals immediately forward. They're there. If any light forces try to get out, they should be able to deal with them. Anything too heavy, they're going to be able to withdraw back on the major force. And you have to think, considering all that actually Warburton-Lee managed to do with the ships he had, imagine what would have happened if Penelope and the Tribals had been part of that initial force. The odds are there wouldn't have been many Germans, even in those conditions, doing that well afterwards. Because, let's be honest, HMS Eskimo is a bit of a snow hound. She does like the snow. She does, in her operation, she does enjoy the snow.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually that although the Arethusa class were theoretically at least designated as commerce protection vessels, you have Penelope here acting effectively as a gigantic flotilla leader, which is pretty much exactly the same role the previous Arethusa class had been specifically designed to do in the run-up to World War One.
Oh, it's amazing, and they do often end up. The Arethusa class are these really cool little cruisers that often get used alongside the larger destroyers as sort of, well, there isn't really a destroyer leader big enough because there is technically the Tribals were built as destroyer leaders. There isn't really a destroyer big enough that it can justify being given the status of a leader of the larger destroyer units. But the Arethusa class fit in quite nicely. And again, in the confines of Norway, in those fjords, she's lethal because that's perfect waters. She's got all these 6-inch guns. She's got all the armor, all the capabilities she needs. She's going in to narrow waters. She can maneuver far easier than a county class or definitely than a battleship or anything else. She can keep up with the destroyers far more effectively than any of the other ships can. So she's perfect. And again, this is the thing. You've got, if the operation had been done as really it should have been, you would have had her, you would have had those 4 Tribals, you would have had, well, you'd have had the H-class flotilla going in, so you'd have had 9 destroyers and a light cruiser going in. I'm not sure. I don't think many of the, as I said, I don't think that is overstating it when I say that even in those conditions, considering what they did achieve, what would have been achieved then, I doubt the Germans would have done very well in that scenario, especially as their submarines keep suffering from premature detonation.
Yes, which is something that will continue to crop up, even though we have now finished the second battle, and we're now moving into the third. So with the remaining German ships bottled up, but the job as they saw it somewhat incomplete, the Royal Navy now turned its mind to finishing off what was left. forming a temporary resupply and repair depot using a captured German transport ship that had some fairly nice cranes, combined with a recently arrived British oiler, which showed up with the destroyer's grenade and encounter in tow. The British found themselves set up with quite the cosy temporary offshore base, which was enhanced still further when a Norwegian salvage vessel and a small fishing fleet full of very enterprising Norwegian mariners with welding torches showed up to help. It was now the 11th. Unfortunately, Penelope managed to run aground, so taking her into the fjord at the head of the remaining destroyers was off the table for the minute, and a draft plan to go back in and finish everything off on the 12th was scrapped. In Narvik, the Germans were up to 6 vaguely operational destroyers, although still short of fuel and ammunition. At least only Ludemann and Roeder were stuck in place without significant access to repairs. However, with ongoing fueling and repair work being undertaken, an order for all remaining destroyers to leave and join up with the two Scharnhorsts produced only Zenker and Gies, who made an abortive attempt only to turn back upon sighting superior British forces in the form of the slowly manoeuvring Penelope and several tribal class who were waiting for them at the entrance.
They were being very friendly. They waved and fired some nice little shots to say hello. And they sort of did the full tribal dance of "we just came to say hello" sort of thing going on. It was a very friendly, warm, fierily happy reception, let's say, that they received at the entrance, and decided that they were going to withdraw.
Mm-hmm.
Which was really rather rude. When a guest comes, if they run straight out the door when you've been waiting for them, prepared such a lovely reception, it's a bit rude.
This situation would continue throughout the night, with Kölner running aground hard and Zenker damaging its propeller as it had moored in a slightly too shallow location and the propeller touched rock as the tide went out, leaving both ships in need of further repairs, whilst close to the British forces, U-48 unleashed another half-dozen torpedoes for its trouble getting 2 near misses and another 4 premature detonations. This prompted U-48's captain, in something of a rage, to sail slightly away from the British forces, surface, and then send a very long, very angry radio message back to Kriegsmarine HQ, which effectively demanded who exactly had issued them with these torpedo magnetic detonators, and could they please be shot?
It works better than when you're dealing with the Mark 14.
Yes. Yeah, to be fair, Admiral Raeder did actually take everything seriously. It just wouldn't really help them in this situation because it was a bit too late. The 12th passed by relatively quietly, with the main excitement being a strike of 8 swordfish from HMS Furious, which had shown up, but poor weather and enthusiastic anti-aircraft fire meant that this accomplished relatively little, apart from a few casualties caused by stray bombs hitting the shore, and 2 of the Norwegian patrol boats that were moored up being sunk by splinter damage in exchange for the loss of 2 aircraft. At this point, German aerial recon spotted 7 to 8 destroyers and a single larger vessel waiting at the head of Westfjorden, leading the Germans to decide to place the crippled Kölner just inside the Narrows in some shallows as a picket ship. The reason for the shallow water being so that if it was sunk, it couldn't sink fully and would thus remain as a stationary gun battery, but since it was in such shallow water, they took its torpedoes off for use on other ships. This work was completed just after midnight on the night of the 12th to 13th. Kühne, Arnim, and Ludemann were now in decent operational shape, with Giese and Zenker under repair, but their weaponry was basically fully functional. Thiele was mostly combat capable, minus a main gun, but was limited in speed and currently undergoing engine repair. Roeder remained completely immobile. However, out at sea, the 12th had seen something of a shift in the Royal Navy's intentions. With the damage to Penelope from grounding, it was decided to switch the role of flagship of the attack to a battleship. The home fleet had shown up, but Valiant and Repulse had almost immediately been detached to look after a troop convoy, which left a choice of Rodney, Renown, or Warspite. Admiral Whitworth was ordered to transfer his flag from Renown to Warspite and then lead the attack along with the tribal class destroyers Bedouin, Punjabi, Eskimo, and Cossack, plus the other destroyers Kimberley, Forester, Icarus, Hero, and Foxhound. Warspite's captain, incidentally, was one Captain Crutchley, who we met last week, although a couple of years later down the line in his career at Savo Island.
One of the interesting things about this whole scenario is that the official line is he's ordered. The unofficial line is he basically campaigns and requests, and it is very, very A, the transfer to Warspite, and B, the ship going in, the battleship, that the Warspite's the battleship going in, are things which are quite late changes, which are officially ordered, but basically ever since he sent in Warburton-Lee and had the misgivings he did and didn't hold them back, Whitworth has been wanting to go in because Whitworth feels he should go in because he ordered one man in, and what happened. Yes, it was successful, but the British lost ships, and Warburton-Lee himself was lost. And he was a senior flotilla commander, so they'd met, they knew each other as much as you do in the sort of the Navy at this sort of time. So it was very much he was going in, and Warspite's taken in because Warspite is judged, and this is going to sound strange when we consider the various ships fail, to be the most maneuverable of the capital ships available. You don't really consider a battleship the most maneuverable asset known to mankind, but she was considered the most maneuverable of the options. And it really should have been another cruiser going in with them, and they did have other cruisers available. But the moment you have an admiral basically saying he's going to go in whatever you send, they decided that he should probably take a battleship with him just to make sure they don't lose an admiral as well through some reason in there.
Yeah, because I was Renown at that point. It's a battle cruiser. It's fast, but it's not the most agile of things. And Rodney, I should say, rather than Nelson class. Although a battleship, she does only have 2 screws, whereas Warspite has 4, which is going to help if it comes to hard maneuvering. And before anybody asks, yes, we know Rodney had 9 16-inch guns and they were all up front. However, you've got to bear in mind C turret is behind B turret, so if they're firing dead ahead, you still can't fire C turret. But more importantly, Warspite has a secondary battery that runs along its entire side, and the secondary guns were probably going to be just as important as the main battery guns in the close confines of the fjord, whereas all of Rodney's 6-inch secondaries were positioned at the stern, which would have forced her to maneuver to bring them to bear if they'd ended up in a knife fight with destroyers.
Plus, Warspite has another advantage. She has a very specific type of spotter reconnaissance float plane. She has a swordfish. And that actually is very useful because the swordfish that were found were actually able to, how do I put this politely, were found to be very, very good in landing in a very small patch of water, in slightly rougher water than they were supposed to be. And this was partially to do with their design, but also partially to do with their general structure and layout and the flexibility inherent with the design that they were built with. So they were very useful for this sort of operation. And she would prove very, very useful for the battle.
Mm-hmm. Air cover from HMS Furious was supposed to keep any Luftwaffe attackers away, at least it was hoped. Although unknown to the Admiralty, there were 5 U-boats in Vestfjorden as well. As the fleet closed in on Narvik on the morning of the 13th, they had a lucky escape in this regard. HMS Eskimo spotted and depth-charged a U-boat, the U-48, but the submarine managed to evade and get a full torpedo spread off at Warspite, albeit once again to no effect. The fleet pulled through the Narrows and deployed for battle. This was a horizontal line across the fjord made up of Punjabi, Bedouin, Eskimo, Cossack, Kimberley and Forester, followed by Warspite, with Icarus and Hero bringing up the rear. As tradition demanded, and the need for quick visual recognition suggested was pragmatic, all ships broke out huge battle ensigns flying from their foremasts.
That is very, very it's very, very fun to have your battle ensigns flying out in fully and look great. But with U-48's commander, I'm often surprised he didn't load himself into a torpedo tube and decide him hitting torpedoes would be more use. And the full angry furor he has. Because you read this account and basically these submarines are positioned beautifully and they should be a major part of the campaign. And honestly, they're just premature detonation, premature detonation, premature detonation, premature detonation. It's almost like they might as well not been there. To some extent, the British would have probably be still taking the same measures they were taking, worrying about them, even if they hadn't been there, than as they were there. It was almost a waste of fuel sending them there because of these issues they keep having.
Yeah, and it's although I haven't managed to read or translate all of the communiques, I have seen some of the communiques that came in from the U-boats in the Norwegian campaign, and specifically around Narvik, that were sent back to Reda. They were very angry people.
They were incredibly angry people. They had about as much anger as the tribal crews at this point, because if you, when you're reading the accounts from the tribal crews, because the tribals were incredibly, because of the way the tribal crews had been trained pre-war, and they saw themselves as elite within the elite, and they saw themselves as the reconnaissance line, as the people, the fighting destroyers, the ones which were built with the extra guns rather than torpedoes, so they could take the fight to the enemy destroyers and could allow the other destroyers to fire torpedoes. They were incredibly angry that they'd seen what they considered a waste of life, what they considered what had happened to the H-class to be a waste, to be something which had been thing, and they're angry over that. But their anger is almost matched. Well, it's probably it's the same, but different perspectives in a way, and caused by different things, by the U-boat commanders over their torpedoes being so ineffective. And it's so frustrating, because they're doing quite well. They're getting into these excellent positions. As you just pointed out, 48 manages to avoid, get through Eskimo. And you do have to admit, when you're looking at the tribal class destroyers, because of the way they're built, they're okay anti-submarine ships. They're okay with their torpedoes, and they've got a good gun set. And they eventually, and by the end of all, they have a great gun set for their size. The main thing about them is the training and their crew and what they expect of themselves. But they're still quite good they might be okay anti-submarines, but still, with Aztec, with depth charges, that's still quite a potent thing. And U-48 managed to dodge it. That's a lot of skill. And then launches. And then gets nothing! Nothing! Seriously, if I'd been the commander of U-48, I'd have probably gone back and wanted to find the designer who came up with that torpedo and ripped him apart with my bare hands. I'd be sitting there going, do you realise what you've done to me? I could have sunk wasp bites.
And the thing is that, unknown to the British fleet, the ships actually managed a second lucky escape a few minutes later. As they cleared the Narrows and deployed the battle ensigns, U-46 managed to get its own bead on Warspite at basically point-blank range, largely by just popping up from the bottom, only to run into a shallow bank and end up getting stuck. By the time it had reversed off, the British ships had sailed past, and it was far too late. Well, happily unaware of this double dodge, Warspite launched its Swordfish floatplane to help with proceedings, which promptly headed up the fjord and began to report on the positions of all the various German destroyers ahead. Thus begun the Third Battle of Narvik.
Sometimes also known as the Great Narvik Turkey Shoot.
Hermann Kuhne would come under fire first. She was escorting Kolner up to her picket position, but as the British opened fire, the German destroyer was already heading back towards Narvik, and so the shells fell short and she drew out of range. Her alert caught the rest of the German force flat-footed. The plan had been to hide destroyers in the side fjords and ambush any British forces as they came up the main channel, albeit that the Swordfish was even now checking out all those side fjords for just such an attempt at a trap. The U-boats in the area of the harbour also either didn't get the alert or didn't realise the importance of it, and so U-64 was still making preparations to get underway when the Swordfish, which was never the world's fastest aircraft and now loaded down with two massive great floats, begun a slow but relentless dive bombing assault, scoring 2 hits with its 2 small anti-submarine bombs, smashing apart the U-boat's hull and leaving it to sink.
But the only kills that has been recorded by those little bombs. Literally, yes. The ship has to be on the surface, not moving, and the Swordfish has to be doing a dive bombing routine. And you can, if any of body thinking about this wants to be scared by the idea of a Swordfish doing dive bombing, you're not the only one. We both are. But technically, the Swordfish were dive bomb capable. So, and they did carry them out. So this is one of the interesting things when people go, oh, the Royal Navy didn't have any dive bombers. Well, they did. They had the Skewer and they had the Swordfish, which were, the one was actually so capable of dive bomber, it was a terrible fighter. And one was still not quite sure of how it bent the laws of physics to turn itself into a dive bomber, but it did. But we're fairly sure magic was involved.
Yeah, I imagine with the amount of drag involved on a float plane equipped Swordfish, the reason for the direct hits is you had plenty of time to probably have tea, biscuits, take a careful aim, and then release the bombs before you reach the bottom of your dive.
It was probably hanging there like a helicopter for a good few minutes. It's probably them sort of going, how the British have developed hovering flights? It's just sitting up there. The first real ultra low Earth orbit synchronous satellite that's been created.
After it pulled out of the dive, the deck gunner of U-64 and the tail gunner of the Swordfish exchanged a few shots in passing, which did manage to riddle the tail of the aircraft, but after a little bit of testing, the Swordfish pilot figured out that he could still fly it, he just had to be a bit more gentle in handling. This would actually be the first aircraft versus submarine kill of World War II, and would be the only time that a battleship's aircraft scored a confirmed submarine kill.
Rather appropriate, it was Warspite, let's be honest.
Reporting back that the side fjords were clear and any remaining enemy destroyers were in the vicinity of Narvik itself, the aircraft began to cruise back down the fjord to find the British ships, taking a number of photos as they went, which have gone on to become fairly famous, and some of which will be appearing here. As it turned out, Kolner couldn't quite make her targeted position in time and instead hid behind a headland, aiming its guns round the corner and hoping that they hadn't been spotted, whilst dearly wishing that they had in fact kept their torpedoes on board. Unfortunately for them, the Swordfish that was meandering back spotted them and signalled Warspite and the rest of the fleet, and so when Bedouin, Punjabi and Eskimo came round the corner, they had every single gun down to the pom-poms aimed right at the hapless German ship. Shockingly enough, Kolner was rapidly immobilised before it could do anything in exchange, and a few minutes later the shape of HMS Warspite's bow loomed large, with its massive main guns aimed in exactly the same direction. A number of 15-inch shells punched clean through the ship without detonating, but the poor Kolner was now being physically torn apart by the force of their passage, with the gun crew able to see the ship flexing and rocking with each impact. A torpedo blew off the bow for good measure, and the ravaged ship, or what was left of it, quite mercifully sunk out of sight. Warspite hadn't even slowed down. Zenker and Arnim, along with Ludeman, sailed out to see what they could do, using the fact that they were in a wider area of the fjord to operate full broadsides against the British ships which were still in line abreast, and could thus only use their forward guns, albeit that the Tribals carried as much forward firepower as most small to medium destroyers did in total. Visibility was much better on the 13th, and the range was quite long, varying from about 10,000 yards all the way to almost 23,000 yards, with the German ships ducking back out of range and evading wildly as they were chased by British fire, whilst the British found themselves at the receiving end of gunnery that they described in the logbook in a very British way as uncomfortably good. Some fog and smoke did remain, however, and the gun smoke from both sides added to this, perhaps accounting for why the only damage on either side was a number of near misses and splinter damage to Cossack. The Zenker angled for its own torpedo attack on Warspite, but had its aim thrown off by fire from the British destroyers and Warspite's secondary battery. Arnhem had better luck targeting the destroyers with its own torpedoes, but once again they ran deep, with the British ships evading most of them, but Cossack having the luck to watch one of them motor on directly under its bridge on a course for the fjord wall. U-25 also took a couple of shots at Cossack, but again nothing to show for it, and the U-boat headed back to the narrowest part of the fjord, intending to ambush the British ships on the way back, hoping that maybe fourth time would be lucky. Having reached the wider part of the fjord, Hero and Foxhound stopped to recover their minesweeping gear, whilst the German ships fell back in the face of the relentless British advance. Smoke from the British destroyers, their gunfire, and her own smoke from firing directly ahead was disrupting Warspite's accuracy, but she nonetheless continued to fire her forward turrets every so often, with the shells howling up the fjord with a noise the one sailor likened to the moans of the damned, whilst the impacts themselves, which were usually on the sides of the fjord as she didn't manage to hit anything in this phase of the fight, were setting off small avalanches with every reverberating boom. And it has to be borne in mind, a fjord is a wonderful echo chamber, so each explosion was truly breathtaking. One German sailor is recorded as briefly wondering as whether or not Warspite was actually trying to bring the fjord down on his ship. A couple of flights of swordfish from the Furious showed up and bombed the German ships, scoring only near misses, although one of these managed to account for the last Norwegian patrol ship, the Kelt, which was sunk by splinter damage. In exchange, 2 more aircraft being shot down. After nearly an hour of firing, with their ammunition reserves depleted by the fight with Warburton-Lee's command a few days before, the German destroyers were beginning to run really low on shells. The Braunfels' loss was being keenly felt at this point. As the range closed, Bay decided that heading into Rombaksfjorden might be a smart idea. The water was too shallow and the channel too narrow for Warspite to follow, so they might at least be able to make an effective use of their last ammunition in a fight with the British destroyers that would surely follow without the risk of being blown in half at a moment's notice. Hermann Kuehne missed the signal and instead beached herself before setting off depth charges in her hull as a form of improvised self-destruct, having literally run out of every single shell aboard, with even the practice and illumination rounds having been fired. Eskimo and Forrester followed her to make sure that she was destroyed, with one of them blowing off her stern with a torpedo just to be on the safe side.
You have to be thorough.
Mm-hmm.
It's important.
And I believe, if I read the archive material rightly, that it was actually a torpedo fired from Eskimo, which does make an awful lot of sense.
Yes. Again, you need to be thorough in these things, and you need to use these torpedoes carefully.
Guise, I think, which had been building steam and was now trying to get out of the harbour to join the action, managed to just about clear the entrance before half her engines locked up. Bedouin and Punjabi approached and both sides fired torpedoes, but both sides missed, and Guise managed to rake Punjabi with its 5-inch guns, causing extensive damage, severing steam pipes and power lines and leaving the guns frozen in position. With its main armament immobilised, Punjabi was forced to break off. As she did so, Guise got the engines back into something like working order and was working up to speed just in time to find Bedouin closing into point-blank range with half a dozen other destroyers watching in the background. To her credit, she did manage to hit Bedouin with one shell before the latter commenced a point-blank course in demolition with guns and torpedoes that left the German ship a burning wreck in short order. Punjabi, I believe, at this point sent a very British signal to Warspite as it headed out, which basically amounted to, terribly sorry, but I can't actually shoot anymore, so I'm going to have to head away and fix all of this.
She actually returns not long afterwards and carries on with the fight. So she pulls back, and I think it's about 30 minutes later she's back in the fight. They basically rebuild the ship in 30 minutes, which is again testament to the Royal Navy crews. They don't understand the concept of quitting, and in Bedouin's case, they don't understand the concept of too close, because there is debate about how far away the point blank range was, but there are descriptions afterwards that some of the explosions of their own guns aboard the target ship actually singed their eyebrows. Yeah. So, it was close.
In the archive documents, there's testimony from one of the pom-pom gunners who talks about once he's unleashing the 40mm pom-pom rounds at the ship, that he's actually having to duck behind the gun shield of his own gun because of ricochets and splinters, which are coming back with enough force that if he stuck his head up above, he'd actually be at risk of being hit by his own fire.
Yeah.
Now, within the harbour itself, Roeder was happily blazing away at anything in range, despite being tied up to a pier. But one shell managed to hit Warspite, who thought the shot must have come from a shore battery and promptly reduced a little bit more of the Norwegian coastline with a full barrage before the circling scouting swordfish pointed out the errant German ship. Cossack dutifully entered the harbour, meandered around through the wrecked freighters and found the Röder. The two promptly lay into each other with vehemence at, again, knife-fighting range. Cossack lost some of her boilers and rudder control and ended up running aground, from which position the aft turrets continued a steady demolition of Guise, which was now on fire. Kimberley joined in, followed by Warspite, wrecking the ship, which self-destructed when Foxhound nosed in to investigate the potential of boarding the ship.
She doesn't really sort of... It's going to sound strange. Cossack runs aground, but not in a normal manner. She bashes through into the harbour for starters, and when she gets there, the thing she runs aground on is actually one of the sunk merchant ships, and that's to get her closer to her target. And from that point, they continue a very methodical destruction, not only of the German vessels, the water, but also any merchant ship which looks like it could still be practical. Also get some shells and anything else they can do. They account for more German infantry from are taken out by HMS Cossack and her 40mm pom-pom than possibly the Norwegian defenders had managed to achieve, because they hadn't been told there was any Germans coming, so they hadn't managed to get to their guns. It was a very considerate effort of Cossack, but again, well backed up. And this is exactly what the tribals were supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be in the front to sort of, in a way, soak up the fire, but also suppress the enemy fire to allow the other destroyers to get in and make the kills. And that is what they're doing in this. Narvik is one of those operations which is first time. The first battle from the Norwegian perspective is definitely not a textbook. The second battle, and the first from British perspective, is it gives you some examples for a textbook, but the third battle, second British battle, is entirely textbook. It's entirely straight of, this is how you fight this sort of battle. This is how you engage in this way, and it does become a model that operations later in the war are copied on, are based on. And interesting enough, the commander of HMS Cossack at this point is not Philip Vian, who was in charge in the Altmark incident. She's back under her regular commander, which is Guy Sherbrooke, who would win a VC later in World War II for his defense of a convoy. Basically, he uses his destroyers to drive off several German heavy ships. And when I say drive off, I mean terrorizes the life out of them.
That's probably a story we shall tell at another time.
Yes.
Kimberley headed in and tried to get Cossack back into deeper water, but unfortunately the tribal class was stuck fast and would have to wait for the next high tide. Instead, as German snipers engaged the sailors on the Cossack's decks, Cossack contented itself by engaging the enemy snipers with full pom-pom salvos, and then found some German field artillery to target with its main battery. I do kind of think engaging a German sniper with an octuple pom-pom mount is something of overkill, but I suppose that's probably the smallest gun they had.
They did also occasionally use the 4.7-inch shells as well for some of the snipers, and I think at some point there is a debate as to whether or not some of Cossack's sailors decide to take a run ashore, but all we know is that when she comes back, she strangely managed to acquire some German car parts, which were supposedly from vehicles that the troops had with them. Not car parts. Sorry, my mistake. Bike parts. She'd taken, including an entire German motorcycle and various other components. And officially, the sailors never go ashore officially. So the question is, where did they appear from?
Yes. Well, I just remembered the tribals have quad pom-poms, not octuple ones. But to be fair, if you're a sniper, if someone's shooting at you with 4 automatic 40mm cannon, I don't think you're going to notice the difference between that and 8.
You're not gonna start there complaining. That's just a quad. I'm gonna stay here till the octuple opens up. You're gonna get quickly out the way. It's just not fun. It's not playing cricket.
So the last four German destroyers had made it into Rombaksfjorden, but of these, Zenker and Arnhem were now completely out of ammunition and had gone off to beach themselves. Thiele and Ludemann did have some ammunition left, however, and waited. The incoming British destroyers were warned by the orbiting Swordfish, and so Eskimo and Forrester entered with all guns blazing. Ludemann fired its last four torpedoes, with one of them running deep under Forrester's bow, even as Eskimo raked its aft guns across the German destroyer. The last operational weapons on the German ship now fell silent. With no further ability to respond, Ludemann headed after Zenker and Arnhem in order to beach itself. Thiele remained in place to buy time and saw an opportunity. Eskimo had moved to evade Ludemann's other torpedoes, but in so doing it had almost run headlong into the fjord wall. Slowing to an emergency halt, she made a perfect target, and Thiele fired off its own torpedoes even as it was being blown to pieces by incoming fire. For a change, one of the German torpedoes malfunctioned in a beneficial way to the Kriegsmarine, with one of the set running along the surface and slamming into Eskimo's bow, which promptly folded down vertically, complete with A turret. Somewhat irritated by this turn of events, B turret decided to keep firing, as did the aft turrets, and when Eskimo's last torpedo narrowly missed, Eskimo's captain, Micklethwaite, reversed course and advanced on the Thiel backwards, with the aft guns still firing.
It's, it's just, again, it's just what you do. You're at a party. You don't leave the party just because you've lost a limb. You carry on taking part. You carry on being the life and soul of the party and making sure everyone has a roastingly good time.
Loose cables and anchor chain hanging from the bow snagged and eventually tore off what was left of the bow that was still attached to the ship, and with the further flooding, Eskimo reluctantly was forced to return towards Narvik, with the crew shoring up the bulkheads under B turret, whilst Hero and Icarus passed by in order to finish off Thiel. Thiel was on fire and on her last legs, the last act of her mortally wounded captain being to run her aground, with her last stand having bought enough time for the other three ships to scuttle themselves in an orderly manner. Hero and Icarus found Arnhem and Zenker having already rolled over, but Ludemann's demolition charges hadn't gone off correctly, and so after a short race by the respective boarding parties, which was won by the boat dispatched by Hero, the British crewmen were very shortly examining the ship and happily looting everything that wasn't physically bolted down. Then Bedouin showed up to spoil the fun, relaying orders that anything that was left afloat needed to be no longer afloat ASAP, and so the boarding crews had to leave, with their loot in tow, and a torpedo from Hero finished off the Ludemann.
Quite literally the loot in tow, because apparently one of the things which, again, there are different accounts as to whether or not one of these was taken out was one of the actual destroyer ship's boats. So, but there is a debate as to whether it was in tow or whether that was a part of it or these things, because again, they were being pretty shot up the decks of the German destroyers, and they almost start to presume that the British destroyers have surface radar before they have surface radar. And it's one of the interesting things that actually filters into their opinions on Chain Home and various other scenarios, because they're presuming the British already have the surface radars on these ships, because that's how they're going for the accuracy. They are missing the rather obvious scenario that you have most of these gun crews being run by chiefs and petty officers who've been in the service for possibly 20 odd years, have been firing destroyer guns for pretty much every day of those 20 years, and wouldn't be where they were if they weren't very, very good at what they were doing. And that is the scenario you've got. But the Germans are presuming, as they often do, that there must be a technical reason for why the British are this accurate and why the British are not afraid of their larger ships. And that is something which Narvik, actually the first Battle of Narvik, more than the second Battle of Narvik from British perspective, really does firm up in the German analysis that the British smaller ships aren't scared of their bigger ships. They had put a lot of money, a lot of effort into building destroyers which were bigger than the British ones, which were supposed to intimidate them. They're supposed to be more, they're supposed to be basically like cruisers in all but name. and the British destroyers, the British small ships didn't care about it. They didn't care that you on paper are supposed to be bigger and better than me. HMS Glowworm had, of course, shown this very dramatically, but it wasn't just her. It was all the destroyers had shown it. And in many ways, that is building on the legacy of World War I, which had been developed in the interwar years. The British have been very careful not to lose a lot of their experienced destroyer captains from World War I. They hadn't got rid of them and gone, oh, we've got to preserve the battleship captains or the cruiser commanders. They had actually done a lot of effort to preserve the Harwich force and the destroyer commanders from there, and to build a culture within the Royal Navy's destroyer force of controlled aggression, but also to an extent almost a can-do optimism that it doesn't matter what the enemy has. We can go and deal with them. We will go and fight them. We don't. Numbers are something for other people to discuss. It's kind of that mythical Sparta phrase. We don't care how many they are, just tell us where they are. Well, that was sort of what the Royal Navy destroyers had almost been trained and inoculated into a view of. We don't care how big, how powerful, how many there are. Tell us where they are. We'll figure out the rest on the way. Because rather than have a plan, you have a senior officer go, this is your objective, go achieve it. And it goes right the way down. You've got Warburton-Lee. When he dies, the next senior officer immediately takes charge. There isn't any worry about it. There isn't any, this thing of checking our timed stamps or these things. No, you're the next senior officer. Warburton-Lee's gone down. Start sending signals. You're acting flotilla leader. And that is what happens. That is how they have to work. And one of the interesting things about Narvik is it very interesting. It almost did have Vian in as well, because Vian was racing a 3D as fast as he could to get close to there, but didn't manage to get there. So there could have been a fifth tribal along. But he was trying to get done with the operation he was down doing so he could come up to there. And of course, the really interesting thing for the Germans is if they had managed to do any damage to the tribals there, they would have actually crippled a lot of the British efforts in Norway, because the tribal destroyers, once the real sort of the surface fighting has an extent finished, find themselves being used quite a lot for being flagship roles for the army ashore. They become the mobile headquarters because they have space to take the army radios as well as the navy radios. And they're small enough to fit into the closer shores, which the cruisers aren't.
With submarines now known to be in the area and a Luftwaffe counterattack potentially in the offing, despite Cossacks' protestations that actually they rather liked it where they were stuck and they would actually rather like to retake the town, Whitworth decided that the job they were there to do was done, as unfortunately the one thing they hadn't brought along was troops. And so instead, Warspite took the smaller destroyers and Punjabi back down the fjord, leaving Bedouin and Kimberley to look after Eskimo and Cossack, along with Ivanhoe and Hostile, who'd shown up later in the day to help out. On their way out, U-25 got that fourth chance it had been waiting for and fired off even more torpedoes. This time, they all refused to detonate, getting U-25 a good depth charging for its troubles. As midnight approached, the battleship and its escort would head back in again to help the damaged ships. Eskimo heading out proudly stern first with a little bit of help from Bedouin, whilst Cossack managed to free herself at high tide, also electing to reverse out with some guiding help from Forrester. Ivanhoe stopped along the side of the fjord to pick up survivors from HMS Hardy, who'd watched the whole thing and were waiting for them, with Admiral Whitworth recommending that troops be sent in under the cover of Warspite's guns to occupy the town. But nothing came of this proposal, which is another big what-if of the Norwegian campaign, with the British ships gradually dispersing to other duties and repairs over the next few days. In the midst of all the wreckage, U-51 popped to the surface, having spent the entire engagement safely resting on the harbour floor, to find that the tanker Jan Wilhelm was the only German surface vessel still afloat, having apparently been missed in all the confusion. Whilst Narvik would periodically be revisited by Allied vessels engaging in shore bombardment, in the course of which the Polish destroyer Grom would be hit and sunk by Luftwaffe aircraft, the main part of the fighting here was over. Whilst the British had missed a major opportunity to recapture Narvik, half of the entire German destroyer force had been sunk, leaving the Kriegsmarine with less than a dozen operational destroyers and a badly reduced stock of supply ships. This would pose serious problems for the rest of the war, as attritional losses would offset new construction to the point of preventing the Kriegsmarine regaining the ability to field multiple destroyer flotillas ever again over the course of the war.
It's a really big what if, that one, but also the interesting thing is the Marines just at this point are forming a division. And so the big problem for Warburton, for Whitworth. They're all W's. For Whitworth was that he didn't even have the Marines aboard Warspite he normally have. He had enough for the gun, but normally he would have taken a surge of Marines aboard for operations. But they hadn't done that. They were trying to form them up into brigades, the 101 Brigade, the 102 Brigade, up to sort of the Royal Marine Division. If he'd had those ashore, he'd have probably sent the Marines ashore to secure Narvik, which would have probably forced the army to scramble to reinforce them, because the Marines couldn't, because it would have been a Marine and Navy party would have secured the area. They'd have probably been supported by Norwegian and defenders as well, would have turned up. So they'd have probably had troops, then the army would come in. And it could have been a very interesting thing if Narvik had been secured early on, because the impact on Norway, well, if you actually have Carsten de Weert and his force, which is the Central Norway force, going to Narvik rather than Namsos, they have advantages of having a railway. Yes, it goes to Sweden. It doesn't go to where they want to, but it does help with getting supplies in. It means you have infrastructure there. You have all sorts of things to get the supplies in and move the supplies along. So you could do a sort of blocking force to set off central Norway and supply it using the railway and try and keep the railway going to keep those forces supplied, to block the Germans going further north and then work south. With the Germans fighting a two-front war, both against the Norwegian troops fighting guerrilla action and the British troops and possibly other Allied troops coming south along with Norwegian troops from the north. That would have been a really interesting what-if scenario for Norway and a what-if scenario for World War II. Because if you think about the course of World War II, how much would have been different if Norway had been secured for the Allies? How much the Arctic convoys would have turned from being the World War II version to similar to the World War I version? Yes, they'd have still had to deal with submarine threat, but there wouldn't have been the surface threat they'd have had to deal with. There wouldn't have been the air threat they'd have had to deal with. That would have all been far further away.
Yeah, and to be honest, even if for whatever reason they hadn't managed to hold Norway, Narvik would have allowed them to hold on to it for longer. And given how close on the heels of the invasion of Norway with the Battle of France began, if the German army and the Luftwaffe, and to an extent the Kriegsmarine, is still engaged in a campaign in Norway, that probably means the Battle of France is delayed, which in turn means France stays in the war longer. It has all sorts of interesting knock-on effects.
And then you have the question of, when does Italy join the war? Because, of course, Italy hasn't joined the war at this point. And in many ways, Mussolini is waiting for Hitler to look like he's winning. And if he's been fighting a stalemate action in Norway, he's not fighting in France and not winning in France. Because, again, if he's got fuel, men, materials all going up to Norway, what can he do in France? And you're losing a lot of troops. A lot of things are going the wrong way. And troops from Norway do get taken down from memory to help out in the Battle of France. So the more you can do in Norway, it's a really big what if.
Yeah. So Admiral Whitworth, he would return to the battlecruiser squadron before eventually becoming second Sea Lord and then the head of Rosyth Naval Base, or Rosyth, one or the other. Captain Crutchley, as we learned last week, would go on to flag rank in the Pacific, working quite closely with the Royal Australian Navy. Captain Bay would become head of a destroyer division and later, as the Admiral, take Scharnhorst out on her final voyage, so he didn't have much luck. Captains Warburton-Lee and Commodore Bonte would both receive posthumous awards, the Victoria Cross and Knight's Cross, respectively.